at the first Tea Party in the history of the state. So that was, this has a lot of nostalgia to me, because I really did run as a Tea Party candidate. And if people ask about my political identification, yes, I ran in a Republican primary, but I am Tea Party first. So that to me has always been something important. But it was interesting, one of the speakers, she talked about Europe, and this wasn't part of my talk, but I was a military brat, fourth generation military. And I was in 1981, graduated high school in 1986 from the Sheikh International High School. I was there with all the nations in Europe. But I remember 1983 taking the train, and this back in East Germany, West Germany, and the Soviets controlled East Germany, and you had to keep the shutters down. You went to West Berlin. And I was a Boy Scout. So my dad, who was an Army officer, Lieutenant Colonel, could not go to East Berlin, but as a Boy Scout I could. And I still recall going across Checkpoint Charlie, got the AK-47 pointed down, and then looking around East Berlin at what communism did. And I'll tell you, it's a stark reminder to me as well. Something else, this ties into my speech, as to why I got involved in politics, is, again, I've been a conservative throughout my life. Everyone in the military is conservative. It's conservative, well, it used to be much more. But when I went to Afghanistan, I had a unique experience. When I got there, we were in the southern region of Afghanistan. And that's the one that, got hit a bunch. 60% of the violence, thank you, appreciate it, was in one part of Afghanistan. The unique thing we got there was, it was the European area of operation. So we had the Canadians, we had the Romanians, we had the British, we had the Dutch, and some other nations were there. So unique situation, it's almost always all Americans and a few Europeans. Well, this is a sprinkling of Americans, and I ended up being in charge of a province for the Americans, about 100 advisors, with about 10,000 Brits. But I served with the Europeans, and I had these teams out there, little captains and sergeants commanding these teams that were advising the Afghans against operations against the Taliban. Here's what I saw that drove me into politics and made me Tea Party. And this is the incredible thing that war does sometimes, is serving with the Europeans, I saw freedom next to socialism. I saw Judeo-Christian values, and I don't care what our president says, we are a Judeo-Christian people founded upon Christian principles. That means we don't hate other people. You can free to worship anything you want in our country, but it's in the rubric of the idea that we are a Christian nation, and we allow that freedom because only the Holy Spirit brings conversion. I say that because Europe is post-Christian. It really is. There are Christians there, but it's a different culture. It's a socialist culture now, about as close to socialist as you can get. And I saw the strength of America, the free Americans, most were citizen soldiers, next to the Europeans, and the difference was stark. What I saw was these teams, you put them out there, and things that should have been done a year before were done like that. Why? Because in America, you've got to use initiative. You've got to use hard work. If you don't, you're not going to make it. America breeds that in people. It changes us into who we are. There was a liberal reporter that came out to Helmand when I was serving there. And he said, there is something about Americans, when I see you guys out there, the swagger, the confidence that you Americans have. He's an American reporter. And he had to admit it, that we're different. What was that difference? It's our nation. It's our system. It's the fact that our founders set a system where it wasn't about big government. It was based on the biblical values that we brought over from Europe to get away. That's who and who we are. And I saw that. And that was the amazing thing of watching what America did to the soldiers on the battlefield and the difference with the Europeans. And what got me into all this was I came back home and really realizing who and what we were. And remember, I lived in Europe growing up. You get military brass, I know the Europeans are. And I want to be careful here because I fought with the British, the brothers in arms, so I respect them. I saw some of them die out there fighting. But we're different. And that's what I saw coming back home is that we in America are heading as fast as we could toward Europe. And I'm thinking this is so crazy. If you only knew the strength of America, what we've done, what the difference we are, you would see that that's who we are. It's about freedom. Freedom is what works, government doesn't work. It's about the idea that we put our faith in God. Our founder said something, it's so important. And folks are libertarian. I'm libertarian in many ways, but people have better recognized that our founder said we are endowed by our Creator. That's important, because we're not an atheist country as a whole. We believe that our rights come from God. And if we ever lose that as a general belief, we're going to be European. We're going to be Soviet. We're going to be communist. We're going to lose everything we've got. So I firmly believe we are headed in the direction of Europe as a socialist nation, as a post-Christian nation, and frankly, the bad thing is that I ran for lieutenant governor. I announced my candidacy just after speaking on the thanks for the Tea Party candidate. but it's only gotten worse. I ran the race, made it all the way to the runoff, and then lost the runoff, and that's God stopped me. That's the reason I lost, and I accept it. But I learned a lot through the time. And it's also led me to look back at my time in the Middle East. I served 2 times in Kuwait. I served a peace commission in Egypt, the Peace of Israel. That's a lot of big ideas. My uncle was Egypt, and so I've got a lot of knowledge of that part of the world. And here's something I think that needs to be sort of presented and understood, is we talk about Lindsey Graham. And frankly, I think this is great. Well, here's the thing, is we all look at the obvious things, okay, immigration, we look at numbers of the fiscal issues, the TAR bailout votes, all those kind of various things. But I'm going to tell you from my standpoint of having been there and seen things in the Middle East and understanding the Muslim Brotherhood and radical Islam, is I personally do not believe that Lindsey Graham gets it when it comes to the Muslim Brotherhood and radical Islam. And that's what I'm going to talk about here. Because what I passed out was an article I wrote back 2 years ago, actually over 2 years ago. And this is the start of what they call the Arab Spring. Not to brag, but you guys need to see credibility. Okay? And the article's written before events occur. Okay? Frankly, you will see that I predicted the events and what would occur in supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. Lindsey Graham and John McCain, quite frankly, were pushing Obama toward the idea that Mubarak had to go in Egypt. Yeah. Bad choice. Yes. And as we look at different things to criticize in our state and everything else, again, we talk about immigration, we talk about fiscal stuff and all that. It needs to be said that there are issues here in foreign policy, and just because someone's a senator, just because someone sets a certain perception, does not mean they're an expert in everything they do. Supporting certain groups in Libya, not paying attention to who's there in the rebel groups, some we know had ties to Al-Qaeda, had ties to radical Islam, was not a wise decision. It was not. And so what we see is a reflexive attitude that in the Muslim world, in certain areas, we always back those trying to topple what we see as dictators. Not always in American interest. And frankly, throughout most of our recent history, Republican presidents like Ronald Reagan and others have understood that that's just the truth. If you look at some history, I'm going through a very broad brush of sort of Islamic history, it's important. As I say this issue is not about hate toward individuals. Because again, in America, you can believe whatever you want. You can be a Scientologist, you can be Muslim, it doesn't matter. That's not the issue. We're a free country because we're a Christian-based country in our worldview. Within the Islamic world, those that are very serious, and we'll say serious, sort of radical Islam idea, is those who take the early days of Islam, which has a different history. Muhammad himself was the political leader, was the military leader, was a religious leader, all wrapped up into one. After he died, jihad, which was not just an internal struggle, it was also the idea that Islam had to physically conquer the world for Sharia law, to essentially make Islam mean submission. And within 90 years of his death, all the Middle East, all North Africa, all of Spain, up into France, the Byzantine Empire, were all crushed, were all conquered by jihad. Now, you look at places like Syria, eventually the Caliphate was essentially the successors to Muhammad became the leaders of the Islamic world. And so you had various different leaders, but again, the difference between that and the Christian world was there was no separation of church and state in a good way that we see it, which is that basically magistrates make laws and religious leaders worry about souls and that sort of thing. With the Islamic world, there was never a separation. There was never sort of the seeds for democracy. There just wasn't. So you look through history, what you had was a caliphate that actually moved to Damascus, which is why Syria is important. I'll talk about that in a second. But then eventually it moved into Istanbul, which is in Turkey. And Turks are different than Arabs. That's a very, very important distinction, which we'll talk about in a second too. You come toward modern history, and remember, throughout almost 1,000 years, arguably, Islam was sort of the greatest power on earth in many ways. Almost conquered Europe from both sides, throughout up really until about the Second Siege of Vienna in the late 1600s. So it was a powerful, powerful force. But it was a force that was very militaristic. It was one that there wasn't democracy. It was Sharia law underneath, again, a single ruler who was a religious leader, political leader, military leader, all wrapped up into one. Now, fast forward to World War I. This is very important understanding, something I don't think that John McCain and Lindsey Graham get. During World War I, the Ottoman Empire was controlling the Islamic world, which included back in the Arab world. They're called the sick man of Europe because at that time they were very weak. But during World War I, not only did the Central Powers lose, but Turkey lost too. The Ottoman Empire did. And so essentially what you had the Arab Middle East open up to European powers. And because they had just come out of the rule of the Ottomans, Syria was taken over, was basically a protectorate by the French. And then you had what there was in Palestine and Egypt taken over by the British. So you had sort of European control at that time. Turkey, and this is very important to understand, became a secular nation. One of the greatest men I believe in history is a guy named Kemal Atatürk. And he dissolved the caliphate in 1924. He basically took all of Islamic writings out of their political doctrines, made Turkey a free, secular nation. And it was great. Actually, Turkey, for many years, now the problem because it was kind of going backward, but it really did become a very secular nation that we could sort of adapt to. It became part of NATO eventually. But here was the issue. The reaction to him dissolving the caliphate was the Muslim Brotherhood, which really, some people say 1928, really right after he dissolved the caliphate, the Muslim Brotherhood came back. The primary issue of the Muslim Brotherhood was to bring back the caliphate, to bring back Sharia law, to bring back the idea that, look, democracy, Western values are not good. We need to get back to the Quran. We need to get back to Salafis. That's the power we need to be. Here's the big issue. When you see Al-Qaeda, when you see Hamas, when you see all these groups, the germ, the seed for all of them is the Muslim Brotherhood. I believe, personal opinion, that it's, again, serving 4 times the Middle East, including Afghanistan, having relatives in the Middle East who are Christian, the greatest enemy we've got now that communism is gone is the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. If you look at these countries, and I'll go through both Egypt and Egypt at that time, this is after World War I. Actually, after World War II, you had a king who was put in power by the British, but the British really controlled Egypt. But in the early 50s, a guy named Nasser took over in they call it free officer revolt. He was a captain. He took control of the country. He leaned somewhat to the communists, but he was not an Islamist. He was a secular Arab nationalist. And in fact, he understood something that sometimes we don't, which is he jailed the Islamists. He took the Muslim Brotherhood and put them in jail. Now, while they were in jail, there was masterminds that wrote these incredible books about the Quran, which Al-Qaeda used. And the idea was, let's go back, let's forget the Western values, democracy, freedom, individual rights. We need to get back to Sharia law. What is Sharia law? Sharia law essentially was the law after Muhammad for many, many years in the Caliphate, where we would be dhimmis. If you're a non-Muslim, you're a dhimmi. You have less rights than Muslims do. Women have less rights than Muslims do. You can't change religion if you're a Muslim. You can't be a missionary. All the things that we see, we read about, people being killed, becoming Christian, all this sort of thing, that's under Sharia law. That's what the Muslim Brotherhood wanted to bring back. Nasser saw the issue with it. And in fact, with Nasser, interesting thing is he promoted Christians. And I want to tell you something, I love Israel, but my uncle-in-law's father was the Egyptian general as a Christian. Okay? I'm not backing Nasser, because Nasser, quite frankly, also leaned to the communists, so there's some issues. But here's the point. The point was that he and then Sadat, who came afterward and made peace with the Israelis, understood the Muslim Brotherhood was the greatest danger to peace, to stability, to everything we had there. And generally the Egyptian military, they've been trained at Sandhurst, a lot of senior officers. They were a good force for sort of secularizing, westernizing Egypt. Well, Muslim Brotherhood killed Sadat, which you guys may know back in it was 1981, as I recall correctly. And Mubarak took power. And Mubarak wasn't perfect. I won't go there at all, but I will tell you this much. Again, having spent many years going back and forth to Egypt, relatives in Egypt, is the feeling was that he really put the clamps in the Muslim Brotherhood and kept, in many ways, a lot of stability in Egypt. He did. And so that's where you kind of come forward to what happened 2.5 years ago, which was, what do we do as we see the Muslim Brotherhood attempting to sort of use the guise of the Arab Spring, what happened over Tunisia and everywhere else? They're starting to take, where do we go? What do we do? My article talks about that, saying we do not need to back the Muslim Brotherhood against Mubarak. We don't need to do it. There's some different things we can do as Americans, but for our foreign policy needs to be American interest. Sometimes our interest is not necessarily in supporting what we see as unbridled democracy outside the rule of law that's going to bring people to power that are against our interests. In this case, we ended up, partly up to folks, again, John McCain and Lindsey Graham World War II, pushing Obama toward supporting the Muslim Brotherhood to take over in Egypt. Now in Libya, same thing we saw. Gaddafi was not a good guy. Glad to see he's gone. but very little thought into who is actually in the rebellion. Who are we sending $1 million pop cruise missiles in to take out Gaddafi? Well, as we found later, a lot of these groups were not our good guys we saw in Benghazi. These were Al-Qaeda-based, Islamist-based, worse enemies than Gaddafi was, because Gaddafi was crazy, but Gaddafi actually gave up his chemical weapons program and was trying to do some things to sort of stabilize Libya. We supported on this whole guise that democracy is always the best thing, even if it's outside the rule of law, and even if the people trying to take democracy are trying to use the levers to destroy democracy, that's who we supported. Now you come to Syria. Big issues. And this is a tough one right now, because many of the same factors I talked about within the Muslim Brotherhood, within Al-Qaeda, with all this, is that Islamist fervor. You've got Assad. Now, a quick history on Syria is we had talked about the fact that at one time it was a seat of the caliphate. It's a very important city. Damascus is a very important city in the Middle East. So a very important place. When the French took over after World War I, it was all one country. They broke off Lebanon because they had a Christian majority in Lebanon. And then eventually they left, and the Assad family took power. Now, here's the thing with Assad, is he and his father were Alawites. They're considered a sort of heretical branch of Islam, if you will. Very important to understand the distinction. It's one of the reasons why they're tied in with the Iranians, and the Iranians are Shiite, which is also, again, a branch of the Sunnis. So there is a tie there. But here's the thing, is that because they're a religious minority, if you talk to most Syrians, they did protect the Christian communities within Syria. So there was some good, though the bad obviously being connected to Hezbollah and connected to Iran. But when the rebellion came, we had a choice to make 2.5 years ago. Who do we support? And again, the knee-jerk response was kind of, rebellions are always good. Just, we need to topple dictators. Well, wait a second. John McCain and Lindsey Graham, who are we supporting? No one gave really thought to that, about the fact that there are many groups right now that are underneath the rebellion. What's really going on is the current Turkish president, unfortunately, is an Islamist, Erdogan. And he is helping train what's basically Al-Qaeda-based, Islamist-based rebel groups in that part of Turkey to send in. We, unfortunately, because we generally have not found that nuance about Erdogan, have been supporting many of those groups. And in fact, I'm worried, very concerned, those would be the groups that would eventually come in and take power. There is the Free Syrian Army. And actually, from what I'm reading right now, that is a much more secularized, it's being led by a regular army colonel. It seems to be a force that we could possibly support, but there's a small element within Syria. So here's the issue. The issue was we took a knee-jerk response to the rebellion to say we're going to support rebels because there's a dictator in power and we want him out. Not very smart. And so we come to the whole issue of the red lines and everything else. And chemical weapons, believe me, that was my biggest fear over the Middle East. I remember deploying over one time in '94. We were told Saddam Hussein had 7 divisions on the border, they'd uploaded chemical weapons. I was scared, I'll be quite frank, because I could be shot, at least you die, but sarin gas, that stuff's all bad. Okay, I will not at all. And that does concern me that we now have Assad having used, it looks like. Now, of course, there's question marks as to whether or not it's the rebels. We don't know. And this is where what comes down to where a lot of bad decisions and where guys, I believe, like Lindsey Graham, need to be held to account, is why didn't you, just like when it came to Egypt, why didn't you pay attention to what the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamists, the Al-Qaeda were doing in folks you were supporting? Because I see them as the greatest enemy to me, even greater, as bad as Assad is, than Assad, because they really want to destroy us. So now we come down to what do we do? Well, you guys have frankly put us in a position. Obama has for the weakness and indecisiveness and everything else, but frankly, own Republican leadership in some cases has really made terrible decisions in not understanding the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamists, that influence. So when they ask me, look, we get a chance, and we have a chance now to go to the Free Syrian Army and possibly through covert action do something to arm them. But I will not at all stand behind assisting groups that are Al-Qaeda-based, they're Islamist-based. Their plan is to get in there and set up another Taliban-type government, reestablish a caliphate, bring the Muslim Brotherhood in. I will not stand for that at all. So as we as Americans look at this, it's a tough one they put us into, but quite frankly, at this point right now, we're in a position where we're either supporting Islamists or we're supporting Assad. And we've also done some stupid militarily, which is that I don't care what they say, we've now screwed up any kind of military operation, because you don't stand there and run right to the line, take a knee, tell people you're going in. So I'll tell you, right now, he's putting everything in the civilian areas, he's hiding his equipment, it's going to be a very silly operation.
Yeah.
And so, thank you. And the last thing I'd say too on that, as far as the operation goes, is I'm an infantry guy, and I've served on the ground. Air power seems great, but what you realize is you can never go into a military operation believing you're only going to have air power.
That's right.
Thank you. If you go back to Kosovo, we had the entire NATO against little old Serbia, little tiny Serbia, little tiny Serbia. We had like 10,000 to 1 against the Serbians. How long did that take? 2.5 months, and we were like, oh boy, where's our ground plan? Because they're not giving in. Well, guess what? If you go in, you better be prepared to get a bloody nose. In this case, if you're not prepared to put troops on the ground, you need to be careful about not going in at all. And this whole thing of pinprick missile strikes, to me, does not make any sense at all. So, with that, that was, I mean, I obviously covered a number of areas. I wanted to cover somewhat about what I saw going on in Syria, somewhat what I saw in the Muslim Brotherhood. The big takeaway, I think, is, talking to the Tea Party group, is Lindsey Graham needs to go. And he needs to go for a number of reasons. And one of the reasons, quite frankly, beyond all the immigration issues, the economic issues, everything else is that he didn't do enough to really differentiate the Muslim Brotherhood types, their influence, from those who were supporting. He reflexively supported what he saw as being some idealism in democracy, when really it was not, I believe, in the American interest. And we don't need people to continue doing that in our foreign policy. I am considering running for Lindsey Graham's seat. People ask the question. I'm looking at everything. And I'm a team player. This whole thing is, we need to get him out. We need to get a true conservative in there. I'm making a lot of phone calls right now. I'm doing a lot of things to make sure that if and when I do announce, it's all set. I do want you to know I'm considering it, and if I do come out and announce, I think you'll understand some of my motivations. I really, as I watch this thing pan out, I've been watching it closely, and obviously, voting for justices like Sotomayor and Kagan really got my craw. That really, and I don't care what your excuse is about election consequences, you do not vote for Sotomayor and Kagan if you're a pro-lifer, if you believe in marriage, you believe in all these sort of things. Exactly, all that stuff. But that's the first thing, the immigration stuff, watch just the patronizing of saying, now that I've screwed it up for 15, 16 years, you, Republican Party, need to demographically change and grant amnesty just because I've screwed it all up. That to me it goes beyond the pale. And we are a nation of immigrants, but we're a nation of laws first.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
so I say all that to say that this ties in with this whole idea that for some reason, I respect John McCain's service in Vietnam, but I got to tell you, this constant going overseas and telling America that we need to do this, we need to do that because we're the experts when they're really not, needs to stop. So with that, I'll open up for questions.
John McCain is right in the